G'day trendsetters, welcome to episode 10 of the Wabi podcast. Today I'd like to talk about the eclectic apprentice. And no, it's not just a cheesy take on a great Nirvana song, Scentless Apprentice. It's actually the reality that we face spreading and learning the way of tea outside of Japan in the modern age, where people are used to different learning styles and different teaching methods than may be valued under the traditional models of teaching and learning the way of tea, Chano-yu. The different ways of teaching and learning creates a healthy tension, I think, which can potentially enhance the way that tea takes root and spreads throughout the world and adds value to our lives. So I'd like to delve into this topic today and explore eclectic approaches to learning and teaching the way of tea, in contrast to the traditional apprenticeship model of learning and teaching the way of tea. So polish the floor, grab a tea, and tune in. So first I have to explain what I mean about eclectic versus an apprenticeship model. So eclectic approach, one thing that I think crystallises this idea very well is the way that music is learnt in a traditional Western approach. So say you're on your way to master a particular instrument, whether it be an oboe, saxophone, piano, guitar, drums, lute, baroque flute, whatever. As you set off, of course, to get the basics down, you'll start off with one particular teacher, but then over time, you'll start to be exposed to different teachers and different learning opportunities. So for example, you might learn classical techniques from one teacher, jazz improvisation from another, and then folk traditions from yet another teacher. And this will all contribute to your comprehensive advancement in your studies and create a ground for quite a multifaceted education, which fosters versatility and adaptability in your evolution in your music towards creating your own individual style. So by studying under multiple teachers throughout one's musical journey, the artist will receive a multifaceted education and an awareness of different perspectives. And this, of course, is going to cultivate quite a broad understanding and deep appreciation for the greater musical landscape. But on the other hand, an apprenticeship model, we think of something like a plumber or an electrician, and you learn a trade from a professional, a master in their trade, and for a period of, say, 4 years, you'll stick with just the one professional and learn as much as you possibly can about that profession on your way to becoming a professional yourself. And this is very similar to the way that the traditional arts of Japan are learned. So anything that includes the character michi, or way, the way of tea, the way of incense, the way of flowers, you'll learn quite faithfully for a long period of time for one teacher. And by a long period of time, I mean decades. And it is quite uncommon to learn from several teachers as you progress through your particular art, whether it be tea, incense, flowers, the way of the sword, calligraphy, etc., etc. And this apprenticeship model necessitates a deep commitment to one teacher, which cultivates discipline and patience and a very strong bond between teacher and student. And it's in this strong bond through which deep transmission of the art takes place. And it's not just the techniques and procedures, it's also, for lack of a better word, some of the moral code and the spirit of the art that's transmitted through this deep relationship between teacher and student. And because of this psychological and emotional investment that both the teacher and the student undertake when learning a traditional art, i.e. tea, there's a reluctancy and hesitation to encourage learning through different teachers at one time. And this is the very reason why I wish to talk about this podcast today, because throughout my experience of teaching the way of tea, and particularly recently within the last, say, year, I would say, the inquiries about people that are already practicing a particular school or from a particular teacher that wish to practice more than one school or under more than one teacher have increased. And I'm finding that I have to answer through writing in email very unsatisfactory answers to the bigger question about why it's not encouraged to learn from two people at the same time. And to tell the truth, I don't 100% agree with some of my suggestions some of the times, because I actually do think that it is possible to learn from several teachers at the same time in the way of tea or the way of incense, and incorporate some of the things that a musician can enjoy through an eclectic approach in the way of tea also. But of course, this necessitates a hell of a lot of communication and understanding from everybody involved. So the reason that an eclectic approach to learning is usually discouraged in the way of tea is for the reason that it is confusing for the student. And what does this mean? How is it confusing? Well, of course, could be getting conflicting teachings from different teachers. And of course, if you're attempting to learn two schools at the same time, that's going to be extremely confusing. So I can give a good example of my daughter. She's learning 3 languages at the same time: French, Japanese, and English. Stuck in an environment where she has an English mother tongue father, a Japanese mother tongue mother, and the greater environment is French. And so her progression in her language is a little bit slower than other children who are just learning one language. And so she's getting a broad exposure to 3 languages, and she's confusing her languages when she speaks to people. So for instance, when we go back to Australia, she'll communicate with my parents and drop in French and Japanese words here and there, and they don't know what she's saying. And this is very similar to learning multiple schools at the same time. You'll have different emphases on different postures and techniques and values regarding structural rules in the way of tea, like the value of certain utensils and how to handle them, the right places to place utensils on the mat, the way the guest etiquette is handled in the tea room. This will create quite a confusing soup of ideas that may be very hard for somebody that's learning initially to differentiate when they're practicing one or the other school. So I very strongly discourage trying to learn 2 schools at the same time, and would say that just like if you're trying to learn languages, pick one language, get a good grasp of that language, get to the intermediate advanced stage, and then attempt to learn another language if you're interested in that. And this intermediate advanced point is quite an important one, because I think that when somebody reaches a certain stage in their studies of the way of tea, an intermediate level, and certainly if one is an advanced practitioner, I'd say it is an absolute necessity to expose oneself to other schools of tea and other thoughts of how to practice the way of tea. Otherwise, your perspective stays quite narrow, and you start to impose your own values on others rather than have a rounded, empathetic appreciation for the way that other people practice the way of tea. So think about people that only speak one language. They understand the world only from one perspective. But if you speak more than one language, just 2, the awareness and the appreciation that you have for the subtleties in the way people see the world and develop values increases tenfold. It doesn't just stay double, it's tenfold just by learning one different perspective. Your appreciation for the subtleties out there in the greater world increases remarkably. So just like learning a second language, learning, say, guest etiquette for another school of tea will greatly enhance your understanding and appreciation for what all the other schools and different practitioners are doing out there. So if a student is already quite far along their practice in a certain school of tea, I'll be willing to entertain an eclectic approach to learning in the way of tea. I don't necessarily mean going out to learn the different procedures. You might stay comfortable with your own procedures, but just learning the history of another school of tea, or asking a practitioner of another school of tea about where the values are with like breath, body, posture, utensils, aesthetics, and cultivating a more comprehensive understanding about where different schools and different practitioners place their emphasis is a very positive thing to do. So this entails reading literature that are published by schools outside your own school of tea. And the obvious one is that if you are a practitioner of a merchant class school of tea or a warrior class school of tea, looking into that other side, the merchant class perspective or the warrior class perspective, and try and get a deeper understanding about where they're coming from and the way that they emphasise the handling of utensils, the aesthetics that they promote through their practice, and their particular emphasis on human interactions in the tea room. They will really open up completely different worlds of understanding, which I think is an incredibly positive thing for anybody that practices tea. And of course, this is very ripe to be transferred outside your practice of tea and apply it to the outside world, making you a better human being in general. Well, fingers crossed. Now I can give an example about how I have incorporated an eclectic approach to learning in my own learning and understanding of the way of tea, as I've reached an intermediate to advanced stage. Probably the best example would be learning the Shinoryu, the Shino school of incense. In the way of tea, we also have ways of practicing incense and sharing incense in the tea room, compared to how incense is practiced in Kodo, the way of incense. The procedures in the tea room are quite simple. Very simplified versions of the things that you see happen in a Kodo gathering. But the utensils and the mannerisms are very similar, and you can see that there's been a knowledge sharing somewhere in the past, and now as schools have been compartmentalised over the last, say, 200-300 years of Japanese history, the knowledge sharing has decreased. And actually, before I go on, there is an extremely important point there, historical point that needs to be understood. To give us the full perspective about the topic at hand, eclectic versus apprenticeship approaches, the figures that we revere and we talk about all the time, and the golden age of tea, i.e. the Momoyama period and the early Edo period, so from about, say, 1550 to 1650, that 100-year period, is probably the period in the history of the way of tea that's most revered and discussed and holds people's attention, because it's where all these great figures like Senrikyu and Furuta Oribe and Ueda Soko, Oda Uraku, Kobori Enshu, all these people were active and practicing and developing their own individual approach to the way of tea by knowledge sharing between different practitioners. Of course, you have great figures like Rikyu and Oribe that were considered to be number one, and of course everybody wanted to learn from them. But in the end, like the period after Rikyu's death in Fushimi in Kyoto, you had all the great tea masters living basically in the one area in Japan, and there was a great cross-pollinization of ideas and theory from which people developed an individual style. So Oribe was a great collaborator with the second and third generation Shinoryu incense grandmaster. And Ueda Soko learnt for the first 6 years of his tea life under Rikyu, and then for the next 23 years under Oribe. And by learning from Rikyu and Oribe, went on to develop his own individualistic style, which has become the Ueda Sokoryu in later years. But in these initial stages of tea practice, that golden age, it was individual practitioners getting ideas from all over the place. Even Rikyu, of course, revered Juko's writings, Murata Juko, studied his philosophy and incorporated that into an embodied practice, which became his own expression of tea, of course deeply influenced by one of his other teachers, Takeno Jogo. So there's an historical validation for an eclectic approach to learning the way of tea. And by undertaking studies of the Shino school of incense, I've started to see that, these tried and true traditional methods that are practiced in the Shino school kind of ring with a greater pertinence and an urgency in practice than the techniques that I've been taught in the Ueda school. Of course, the Ueda school is primarily a school of tea, not primarily a school of incense. So of course, the Shino school of incense is going to have a lot of force behind its teachings in contrast to a school of tea. And so some of the techniques that I've learnt through my practice of incense, I've incorporated into my practice of incense in the tea room. So kind of merge them and just giving a little bit more emphasis to some of the techniques that I've learnt in the Shino school over the techniques that I've learnt in the Ueda Soko tradition. And already here, alarm bells will be going off for some people. Some people will say, no, you can't do that. As a teacher of the Ueda tradition of tea, you need to uphold strictly the teachings that have come down to you through the current Grand Master and the teachers that I've learnt from, and convey that as faithfully as I can. This would probably be the preferred view that is current in Japan at the moment. But you can see here that there will be a great tension when you take tea outside of Japan and expose it to countries and cultures that are more comfortable with an eclectic approach to learning. So there are some people that will value learning from different teachers and different techniques on the way to developing an individual style, and other people that will not value developing an individual style, saying that it is honouring the tradition that takes precedence. And at times these are not gigantic divergences from the techniques that you've already learnt. Like for instance, when preparing the ash in your incense censer before warming the incense to enjoy the fragrance, there's a particular method for preparing the ash, both in the Shino tradition and the Ueda tradition, and I happen to prefer the Shino tradition way of preparing the ash and incorporate that into my own practice. And another concrete example is when the Shino tradition prepares the incense wood, they just take a single chip of incense and place it into a paper sachet. But in the Ueda tradition, we take multiple chips of incense and put it into a single paper sachet. And I, for one, love the simplicity of opening that paper sachet just to have one single piece of incense there that you scoop and place on top of the mica plate and warm that single piece, and that minimalistic aesthetic I really like, and so I practice that over what I've learnt in the Ueda Soko Ryu. So cultivating this individual style is a benefit for eclectic learning and will be a disbenefit for some people that prefer the apprenticeship model and upholding tradition. And as I'm on sort of shaky ground here, saying right out in the open that I prefer the Shino tradition and actually practice that rather than my own Ueda Soko tradition, this is predicated upon already learning and mastering the particular technique of your own school. And there's parallels with this in other arts or other traditions of learning a particular school of thought. You think about the history of Zen Buddhism. So in China, you'd have people that would go and try and seek out a master that they can learn and progress under. And they'll stop and train at a particular monastery for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years until they feel that they've exhausted all that they can get through this dedication to one particular learning environment and one particular master. And then they'll go out and seek another person to learn from. There's always in the background this value of being disciplined, to be patient and give the relationship as much time as it needs, and even stay longer than what you might feel, because the potential of something more is always there and going deeper. You have to have a certain humility that you don't know whether you've exhausted the learnings possible from a particular master, and always give the relationship a degree of reverence more than what your ego might be telling you in the back of your mind. And another benefit of an eclectic approach to learning is that you'll be exposed to different teachers and different student groups and different practitioners, either from the same school or different school, and this creates quite a healthy environment in general. So at the moment in Japan, I would say that, it's a fact that tea is practiced primarily in silos. Most people will stick to their particular tradition and be quite reluctant to participate in the tea gatherings and events of other schools. I say this I say this at the same time that I'm quite aware of a niche group of people, particularly in Kyoto, that are very open to learning from different practitioners in different schools and practicing with them. And just as a great example, Fukutaro-san conducts tea gatherings quite regularly, in which practitioners from all different schools and even non-practitioners of tea will participate. So last year, I think I was at one of his tea gatherings where there was Urasenke people, Yabanuichi people, Ueda Sokoryu people, Motosenke practitioners. So already in the one tea room, there's 4 different schools of tea getting along, and this is an incredibly healthy thing. But it might not be the practical techniques of conduct in a tea room. It might be listening to a lecture on tea gardens from a Nurisenke practitioner, or it might be listening to a lecture on the aesthetic appreciation of tea bowls from an Uraku school practitioner, or it might be listening to one of my bloody podcasts from a perspective of Ueda Sokoryu practitioner. Exposing oneself to other ideas and other methods of practice and emphases and aesthetics is an incredibly healthy thing towards diluting the politics that is notorious in the tea world. So if people are only learning from one teacher and one school, teachers are inclined to sort of develop their own domain and poo-poo other teachers and other schools and think that what they do in their little domain is the best, of course. And this creates quite an unhealthy, sort of toxic environment for a person to learn the way of tea in. And I would want to discourage this as much as possible. And the eclectic way of learning is a great way to discourage the development of these toxic political environments in the world of tea. And this alludes to one of the disbenefits of an eclectic approach, in that if a teacher is aware that you're learning from another teacher or multiple sources, I would say that just pure human nature dictates that a teacher would be reluctant to give the student some of the more deeper teachings from their viewpoint on the way of tea or the viewpoint of their school. There's a very important trust relationship that develops between teacher and student in the way of tea, and it's through this trust relationship that the deeper teachings are revealed to the student over periods of time. And for me, in my own personal experience, the bond that I've developed with my Grand Master and the things that he's shown me through after cultivating a very deep trust relationship have been some of the most precious teachings that I've ever received from anybody in my life. But this doesn't mean that there can't be a deep trust relationship at the same time that a student is learning from multiple teachers. There's a subtlety here. Think about a child being raised by the community in contrast to just one or two parents. Of course, the parents are going to have the deepest bond with the child, and the highest degree of trust should be between the parent and child. But at the same time, the child is also going to be learning from grandparents or uncles and aunties, family friends, other children, the teachers at school. The community will be raising the student, but at the same time, some of the more profound teachings about life will come through that trust relationship and bond through the parent and child. So you can have one main teacher, and there can be a very clear established relationship with that one teacher that, yes, you're like my parent. The strongest relationship is between us. But at the same time, there can be teachings received from other people. And my own position in the Ueda Soko school is very similar to this. So my main teacher is the Grand Master, but at the same time, when I go to Wafudo, the home of the Ueda Sokoryu, I also learn from the two Deputy Grand Masters, and also Wakasosho, receiving teachings from these people, and also some of the advanced practitioners. I will learn a lot from these people just by being around them and being with them, and I'm absorbing teachings from these people by osmosis. So in this way, one learns from their community while maintaining a very deep bond with their main teacher. So, of course, an apprenticeship model is going to preserve the traditional cultural values of a certain school of tea, and that school of tea will be transmitted most faithfully through an apprenticeship model. But at the same time, this can also cultivate a narrow-mindedness in the learner and also all the practitioners doing that school of tea. A more rounded, eclectic approach will also be necessitated in either the intermediate or advanced stages of learning. Just like as you mature and learn your mother tongue in high school, it's a necessity to start learning a second language so you can start to appreciate the greater world around you. And just by undertaking to learn one other language other than your own, your perspective increases tenfold. And just as I'm coming towards the end of the podcast, I should note one very important point that I should make clear, and that point is that I want to discourage wholeheartedly sensei shopping. So one of the reasons that this topic came up that I didn't articulate before is that I can sense in some inquiries that people are sensei shopping. But there's a great saying in the traditional arts: the teacher appears when the student is ready. So if you've already established a relationship with a particular teacher, this relationship that you've already established deserves your reverence and time and respect in order to see how it's going to flower. I'd be very reluctant to entertain an inquiry from somebody that's trying to seek out the most comfortable learning environment, because that's usually one's ego talking. I want to do the style of tea and learn from the teacher that's going to be the best fit for what I want to do in the way of tea. Learning the way of tea is about being humble, and it's not about what you want. It's about learning a whole tradition of hundreds of years of knowledge and wisdom that's come before you, and from there you can start to understand what you really want, not what you thought you wanted at the onset of practice. It's about leaving your ego at the doorstep and leaving your desires and expectations of the practice at the doorstep, and cultivating a new understanding, a more broad, wider, far-reaching, empathetic view of the world that enhances your relationship with yourself and others. So don't sensei shop, but at the same time make sure that you expose yourself to other traditions and perspectives, and continue to deepen and advance your understanding and appreciation for tea, and transfer that outside your practice of tea into your everyday life. So I reckon that's about it. Thanks for listening, and rock the tea house.